The wind came first. It rushed down from the mountains like something alive, snapping canvas and driving needles of snow into every crack and seam of the camp. By the time Ethan Miller ran back from the frozen creek with his dented tin bucket, the wagons were already gone. The fire pit was cold. The cooking pots were missing. Wagon tracks cut across the clearing and disappeared into a white blur. "Wait," Ethan whispered. No answer came back, only the howl of the wind. He dropped the bucket. It tipped over, spilling a thin skin of ice onto the snow. For a moment he just stood there, heart pounding so hard it made his ears ring. The camp that had been loud with voices that morning, men arguing over coffee, women packing bread, horses snorting in the cold, was now nothing but empty ground and torn footprints. They had left without him. Ethan was 12 years old and already used to being forgotten. His parents had died 2 winters earlier from a fever that swept through their small mining town. Since then, he'd followed wagon trains and work crews, doing small jobs for meals in a place near the fire. Someone always said, "Stick close, kid." Someone always said, "We won't leave without you." But storms don't wait for promises. He pulled his thin coat tighter around his chest and ran in the direction of the tracks. The snow swallowed them fast. Within 50 yards, they were gone. The sky was the color of old iron, heavy and low, and the daylight was already fading, even though it was barely afternoon. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice tearing apart in the wind. Nothing. His fingers burned, then went numb. His boots were soaked from the creek. Each step made a dull crunch that sounded too loud in the empty valley. He knew the stories. Kids who got lost in winter didn't get found. The cold didn't care how young you were or how hard you tried. Ethan felt panic rise in his chest like water in a sinking boat. He thought about building a fire. He searched the camp for scraps of wood, broken crates, anything dry enough to burn. What he found was soaked with snow or already carried away. When he struck his last match, it flared weakly and died in the wind. That's when the cold stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like an enemy. His teeth chattered, his legs shook. The world shrank down to 2 thoughts. I'm alone. I can't stay here. He looked around the valley for shelter. The trees were thin and bare. The rocks were crusted with ice. Then he noticed the hillside to the south. Dark soil showing through the snow where the wind had scraped it clean. A memory stirred, a half-forgotten image from years ago. A trapper sleeping in a dirt bank, warm while the world froze outside. Ethan swallowed. "If I don't move," he said aloud, "I'm not making it through the night." He picked up his small shovel from beside the wagon rut, walked toward the hill, and started digging into the earth, right where the wind couldn't reach him. The shovel hit the hillside with a dull, stubborn sound. Frozen dirt didn't give easily. It cracked in hard clumps, each strike jarring up Ethan's arms and into his shoulders. His hands were stiff, his breath sharp in his chest, but he kept digging. Wind tore across the open valley behind him, but here, close to the slope, it lost some of its bite. He worked fast, not because he was strong, but because fear made him efficient. At first, he only meant to carve out a small hollow, just enough to block the wind. But once the soil began to open, darker and looser beneath the crust, an idea took shape in his mind. If he could go deep enough, the cold might stay outside. He angled the hole downward, like a ramp, not straight in. Snow slid into the entrance and packed itself against the edges, forming a low wall. Ethan didn't know the science of it, but he felt the difference right away. The air inside the shallow tunnel wasn't screaming anymore. It was quiet, still. He crawled in to test it, then crawled back out to dig more. Every few minutes, he had to stop and rub his fingers together, blowing warm breath onto his knuckles. His thin coat was dusted white. His hair was stiff with ice. But the deeper he dug, the darker and calmer it became. By the time the light began to fade, the tunnel was long enough for him to crouch inside. He widened the end of it into a small chamber, scraping dirt out with the shovel and his boots. It wasn't much, just a cramped pocket in the earth, but it felt different from the open air. Protected. Ethan crawled inside again and stayed there longer this time. The wind howled over the hilltop, but it didn't reach him. His ears stopped ringing. His breathing slowed. That scared him more than the storm. Silence in winter could mean safety, or it could mean you were getting too cold to hear anything at all. He pinched his arm hard until it hurt. Good. Pain meant he was still awake. He dragged snow into the entrance and packed it down with his hands and boots, leaving only a narrow opening to crawl through. Then he used his coat to block part of it, like a curtain. The space grew dim and close, smelling of soil and damp clay. Ethan hugged his knees and waited. Time stretched strangely. The storm outside kept screaming, but inside the earth it felt like another world. His shivering slowed. The ache in his toes softened into a dull warmth. He noticed it gradually, the way you notice dawn without meaning to. His breath wasn't puffing white anymore. The dirt beneath his palms didn't feel like ice. It felt cool, steady, almost warm compared to the air outside. "That's weird," he whispered. He pressed his hand against the wall of the chamber. The earth held its temperature, like it had been saving it all day just for him. He remembered the old trapper again, how the man had said, half joking, that the ground never panicked about the weather. Ethan didn't laugh then. He believed it. Still, doubt crept in. What if it collapsed? What if he ran out of air? What if no one came back? The storm didn't care about his questions. So he made himself smaller, curling his body to trap heat. He wrapped his arms around his chest and pulled his knees tight, copying the way dogs slept in winter. He used his scarf to seal another gap in the entrance. Each small change made the space feel safer. The cold outside was trying to kill him. The ground wasn't. That thought settled into him like a promise. "I just need to make it till morning," he said quietly. Snow piled over the entrance as night took hold. The wind roared above him, blind and furious. But inside the hillside, Ethan lay in the dark, listening to his own breathing and feeling something new spread through his body. Not fire, not comfort, but the first fragile sense that he might survive this. Ethan woke up thinking he was dreaming. For a moment, he forgot where he was. The storm wasn't screaming anymore. The wind wasn't clawing at his ears. There was only a deep, quiet stillness, like the inside of a closed room. Then he felt it. Warmth. Not the sharp, burning heat of a fire, not the thin warmth of a blanket. This was different. Steady, surrounding, almost gentle. It pressed against his back and shoulders as if the earth itself had leaned in closer during the night. He opened his eyes to darkness. His breath didn't fog the air. That was the first thing he noticed. The second was that his fingers moved when he told them to. No stabbing pain, no stiff resistance, just movement. "I'm not frozen," he whispered. Carefully, he pushed himself up on one elbow. The walls of the little chamber were damp but not icy. When he laid his palm against the packed soil, it felt cool at first, then strangely comforting, like a stone that had been sitting in the sun all afternoon. Outside, he could hear the wind again, faint and distant, like it was happening in another world. He crawled toward the entrance and peeled back the edge of his coat. Snow had drifted over most of the opening, leaving only a narrow slit of gray light. A blast of cold rushed in and hit his face. He jerked back. The difference was shocking. Inside quiet, still breathable. Outside bitter, violent, alive with cold. Ethan sealed the opening again and sat there, heart racing. Something about this didn't make sense. He had no fire, no stove, no thick walls. And yet, he wasn't shaking. He dug into his pocket and pulled out the small metal thermometer he'd found weeks earlier in an abandoned supply crate. The glass was scratched and the numbers were faded, but it still worked. He used it to check water sometimes, just out of curiosity. Now he pressed it into the dirt beside him and waited. 10 seconds, 20. The red line climbed. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. 80, 85. Then it slowed and stopped just under 90. 87, he breathed. He held it up close to his face, afraid he'd imagined it. But the number stayed there, steady and calm. 87 degrees. Outside, it had to be 30 below by now. Maybe worse. He could hear the storm hammering the hill like it was trying to break it open. And here he was, inside a pocket of earth, warmer than he had ever been in winter. Ethan leaned back against the wall, stunned. It wasn't magic, he knew that. It had to be something simple. The ground didn't change temperature the way the air did. It stayed the same, no matter what the sky decided to do. The deeper you went, the more stable it became. And his little chamber sat right inside that steady zone. His body heat stayed trapped in the small space. The snow packed over the entrance worked like a lid on a pot. Cold air, heavy and sharp, sank into the tunnel and stayed low. Warm air stayed with him. Without meaning to, he had built a shelter that worked with the winter instead of against it. Ethan laughed once, short and breathless. If they could see this, he said. He thought about the wagons, the campfire, the people who had driven all night to escape the storm. He imagined them burning through their firewood, coughing in smoke, stamping their feet to stay alive. And here he was, a kid in a dirt hole, warm enough to take off his gloves. The thought scared him, not because it felt wrong, but because it meant he might actually live. He rearranged the chamber, scraping the floor flatter and stacking loose dirt into a low ridge behind him. He tucked his coat under his back for insulation and kept the thermometer close, checking it again and again like it might disappear. It didn't. 87. The storm raged on above him. Snow piled higher over the entrance. The world he knew had become a white wall of danger. But inside the hill, time slowed. For the first time since he had been left behind, Ethan wasn't counting minutes. He was counting heartbeats, and each one told him the same quiet truth. The cold had lost its grip on him. The storm broke on the fourth morning. Not gently. It didn't fade away like a tired animal. It pulled back all at once, leaving the sky scraped clean and blue, the kind of sharp blue that only shows up after something terrible has passed. Ethan knew it before he saw it. Light leaked into the tunnel in a thin silver line. The wind was gone. The silence felt different now, empty instead of dangerous. He pushed snow away from the entrance and crawled out. The valley looked like a different planet. Drifts buried the old camp. The creek was sealed under a lid of ice. His footprints from days ago were gone, erased like they had never existed. He stood there blinking in the brightness, his legs shaky but working. He hadn't realized how cramped his world had become until he stepped back into the open. That's when he heard it. Voices. Not the wind, not the creak of trees. Human voices, shouting his name. "Ethan, kid, you out here?" He froze, afraid his ears were lying to him. Then he saw them. 3 men moving across the snow on snowshoes, bundled in thick coats, rifles slung over their backs. Searchers. "Here," he yelled, his voice breaking halfway through the word. They turned. One of them dropped to a knee like he'd been shot, staring. Another ran toward him and grabbed his shoulders. "Good Lord, man," the man said. "You're alive." They looked him over like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. No blue lips, no shaking, no glassy eyes. Just a skinny boy with dirt on his coat and snow in his hair. "We thought," one of them started, then stopped. They followed Ethan back to the hillside. He showed them the entrance, just a dark hole in the snow, barely wide enough to crawl through. "You stayed in there?" the oldest man asked. Ethan nodded. They ducked inside one by one. The change hit them instantly. One man let out a low whistle. "It's warm." Another took off his gloves without thinking. "This ain't right." They stood there, boots planted in packed dirt, breathing air that didn't burn their lungs. Their faces shifted from worry to confusion to something close to awe. "You didn't build a fire?" one asked. Ethan shook his head. "Didn't have anything to burn." "Huh. How long were you in here?" 3 nights, maybe 4. The men exchanged looks. Outside, the temperature still cut like a blade. Inside, the little chamber held steady, quiet and calm. Ethan pulled the thermometer from his pocket and held it out. "Look." The red line sat just under 90. 87, the oldest man said slowly. "You're telling me it's almost 90 in here?" Ethan shrugged. "It was like that yesterday, too." They walked the small space, tapping the dirt walls, crouching to feel the floor. One man pressed his palm flat against the earth and left it there. "The ground's warm," he said. "Not warm," the other answered. "Steady." They didn't talk much after that. They just stood there thinking. Back at the camp, word spread fast. By afternoon, more people came. Men, women, even a few kids bundled in borrowed coats. They crawled into the hole one by one and came out shaking their heads. "No stove? No chimney? Just dirt?" Ethan sat on a crate and watched them react. Some laughed like it was a joke. Some looked scared, like the earth had tricked them. A few looked thoughtful in a way that made him nervous. One woman knelt in front of him. "You should have frozen," she said softly. "But you didn't." Ethan didn't know how to answer that. He only knew what he had felt in the dark, how the cold had stayed outside while the hill wrapped around him like a shell. By sunset, the talk in the camp wasn't about the storm anymore. It was about the hole in the hillside, about how a boy with no fire had stayed warmer than grown men with wood and matches, about how something simple had worked when everything else had failed. And without meaning to, Ethan understood something new. He hadn't just survived the storm. He had found a way through it that nobody else had thought to try. By the time the next storm rolled in, the camp looked different. Not in big ways, not yet, but small changes were everywhere. Someone had dug a shallow shelter into the south side of a hill and covered the roof with packed snow and brush. Another family had widened their root cellar and lined it with boards, saying it felt warmer than the cabin at night. A trapper built a narrow tunnel from his shack into the slope behind it, just enough to sleep in when the wind got mean. Nobody said they were copying Ethan. They just said things like, "It seems smarter this way," or "The ground don't fight you like the air does." Ethan was sent to live with a family downriver, folks who had lost a son the year before and didn't want another winter to take something from them. They gave him a real bed, a real plate at supper, and a coat that didn't smell like smoke. But before he left, people kept asking to see the hole in the hill. They stood inside it with their hats off like it was a church. They touched the dirt walls. They tested the air with careful breaths. Some smiled. Some went quiet. One old man said, "Funny thing, we've been burning trees for heat our whole lives. Never thought about using the ground." Ethan didn't think of it as invention. To him, it was just something he had done because he had to. But that winter, fewer people burned through their woodpiles. Fewer kids coughed through the night. Mornings came without frost on the inside of the windows. And the story traveled. A teamster carried it to the next town. A letter went east with a sketch drawn in charcoal. A preacher mentioned it in a sermon about listening instead of fighting. They didn't call it a miracle. They called it sense. Years later, when Ethan was grown, he passed through that valley again. The old camp was gone, but the hillside still held the shape of his shelter, softened by grass and time. Nearby stood houses with back rooms dug into the slope, root cellars big enough to sleep in, doors that opened downhill instead of out into the wind. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, feeling the quiet. He remembered the sound of the storm, the way the dark pressed in, the moment he realized the cold had stopped chasing him. He had been just a kid, alone, scared, cold, and the earth had answered. Not with fire, not with noise, but with steadiness. That's what saved him. Not strength, not luck, but the choice to work with what was already there. So here's the question for you. If you were left out in the cold, would you fight it the way everyone else does? Or would you look for a different way in? Would you build up or dig down? And how many solutions are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to try them? If this story made you think, hit that subscribe button. Every week, we share real survival ideas and forgotten wisdom. Stories about people who lived because they adapted, not because they were the strongest. Drop a comment and tell us, what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? And could you see yourself building something like Ethan's shelter if you had to? Because out on the frontier and in life, it's not about who's toughest. It's about who learns fastest. And if you made it to the end of this story, you're exactly the kind of person who would have survived it.